bona tarda. Benvinguts a aquesta primera...
Good afternoon. Welcome to this first session, environment. Ecological reparations of colonialism. We have four things to deal with, which will be presented by four people. Recalling with colonial conservation will be the first one, and it will be presented by Colin, Luoma, a senior lecturer in law from the Brunel University in London. His research is focusing on the different intersection on cultural rights of peoples in the context of transitional justice. He formerly worked in the Department of Strategic Legal Cases of Advocacy and Research related to climate and environmental justice for the indigenous peoples. He's a doctor in law and a lawyer in the United States. So I will give the floor to Colin.
Oh, many thanks for that kind introduction, and thank you to the organizers of the conference tonight. I'm very pleased to be invited to be part of this dialogue. I do a bit of research at the intersections of transitional justice, historical redress, indigenous people's rights, and environmental justice. So I was quite keen to participate in the discussion and exchange on some of these incredibly important and timely issues. In general, I think that the impacts and legacies of colonialism on the environment are not discussed nearly enough in the context of the environmental crises that our planet is facing. And so I'm very pleased to be in conversation with you on these issues. The title of my talk today is called Reckoning with Colonial Conservation, and it's really an amalgamation of a couple different papers that are interrogating this concept of colonial conservation, or sometimes it's called fortress conservation, as well as drawing on my own experiences as a human rights lawyer that's defending indigenous communities in the context of conservation projects. And so the main argument of my talk, of my presentation, is that a global reckoning with colonial conservation and the attendant large-scale harm that is perpetrated against indigenous peoples in particular can be fairly conceptualized and justified as a transitional justice case. At the same time, a transitional justice approach is unlikely to deliver what the victims of colonial conservation, indigenous peoples namely, principally demand, which is namely the restitution of their lands, territories, and resources. And for that reason, any transitional justice mechanisms or processes that are employed should be approached quite modestly and in complement to broader long-term reforms aimed at restitution and decolonization. I'll begin today by trying to trace some of the inextricable links between colonialism, lack of indigenous land tenure, and some of the ideologies that continue to persist in global conservation policies today. And then I'll try to situate the violence of conservation in some of the early colonial ideologies and practices around the preservation of nature. I'll briefly talk about calls to reckon with the legacies of colonial conservation, which have often invoked the language and tools of transitional justice, but have yet to materialize into a kind of a formal transitional justice response. And finally, I'll spend some time discussing the various justifications, dilemmas, opportunities associated with using the logic and the tools of transitional justice in this context, and reflect on the value of such an endeavor. Perfect. So the conservation of nature is not only seen as an ecological imperative in our kind of modern society, but also very much aligned with human rights, with social justice, with collective well-being. nature conservation can take multiple forms, but in much of the world, and particularly in the global south, conservation policy is dominated by the creation and enforcement of what are called protected areas. Now, the Convention on Biological Diversity, which is the most important international treaty governing conservation of biological diversity at the international level, it defines a protected area as a geographically defined area which is designated or regulated and managed to achieve specific conservation objectives, which is quite a mouthful, but I think it's fair to think about them as national parks, wilderness areas, nature reserves, game reserves, etc. And perhaps many of you in this room probably have at some point in time been a tourist in some protected area, maybe in this country or maybe somewhere else. The photo on the right-hand side of this slide is an example of a protected area. It's a picture of the Lamar Valley in Yellowstone National Park, the first ever national park created, by the way, and the protected area that happened to be just a few hours from my childhood home in the United States. Yellowstone is a major source of pride for the region. It's a massive tourist destination, a key source of revenue in a mostly kind of rural area. But it's rarely acknowledged that Yellowstone National Park was created through the forest removal and the forced exclusion of indigenous peoples, the numerous Native American nations who had been occupying and using that territory for millennia before it was denominated as a protected area. To understand the negative impact that prevailing nature conservation policy at the global level has had on indigenous rights and livelihoods, it's worth tracing it back some to core principles inherent in colonial projects. And this is certainly not an exhaustive list, but at its most fundamental level, colonialism is premised on the exploitation of colonized people, their territories, and resources. So indigenous peoples in the colonial project were treated as objects that needed to be subjugated, removed, and often eliminated in order to exploit their labor, but more importantly, to guarantee unfettered access to their lands, territories, and resources. This separation of indigenous peoples from their natural environments was a crucial component of colonization, and one that persists in modern contemporary conservation strategies with devastating consequences for both indigenous peoples and the environment. And three things in particular, three colonial tools, I should say, were key for separating indigenous peoples from their natural environments. The first, which I'll discuss, is the implementation of individualized property regimes in colonial settings. So, as most of you know, prior to colonization, indigenous communities generally held and used their territories collectively for the benefit of the entire group. Colonialism obviously disrupted communal land systems, and laws were enacted to impose individualized land tenure regimes in the colonies. As a consequence of this, indigenous peoples were deprived of massive portions of their territories, particularly through individual titling schemes, which have been used to prevent these communities from accessing and safeguarding their lands. The supremacy that was placed on individual ownership and the corresponding non-recognition of traditional or customary land tenure also had negative environmental consequences, including deforestation, biodiversity loss, and other forms of environmental destruction. The second tool is the primacy that was placed on land cultivation and agriculture, meaning that indigenous peoples' lands were often deprived of legal protection unless they were used according to Western ideals. So cultivation was the gold standard of colonial enterprises, while traditional indigenous land uses were deemed uncivilized or backwards. The fact that some indigenous communities did not use land in the same way as Europeans served as a pretext to treat their land as unoccupied and thus free for the taking. So under the doctrine of terra nullius, a legal doctrine, colonial powers justified their appropriation of uncultivated wilderness well into the 20th century. And finally, the widespread plunder of natural resources was a hallmark of colonization. Nature was something that was to be commodified in order to enrich the metropole. In turn, indigenous territories were treated as business enterprises with seemingly unlimited resources to exploit. And undoubtedly, this had dire environmental consequences. But it was only upon some realization that their activities were causing this sort of rapid environmental degradation did colonial powers begin to concern themselves with the preservation of nature. But instead of coming to grips with the environmental toll brought about by their own behavior, colonial powers and later successor independent states consistently blamed local communities, indigenous peoples, for environmental degradation. And they prohibited them from having any governance role in the protection of their own environments. What ultimately emerged was that nature was something that should first be exploited and then preserved, but all without the input, involvement, or participation of indigenous populations. The genesis of this ideology, essentially that humans are incompatible and actually superior to nature, and that the two must be separated, is firmly rooted in the American experience. Westward expansion in the U.S. brought white settlers in contact with some of the most pristine landscapes in the world, as well as their long-standing stewards, the various Native American peoples that occupied and shaped these territories for millennia. In the late 19th century, leading environmentalists began to prioritize the preservation rather than development of these landscapes, again, leading to the establishment of the first protected areas. This idea that nature can only be protected and flourish when segregated from human presence is now mostly discussed under the banner of fortress conservation or colonial conservation. But this approach, essentially removing inhabitants and cordoning off huge swaths of land, was subsequently exported to other parts of the world, right? A colonial enterprise in and of itself, under the basic premise that nature must be sequestered from human presence. In turn, the number of state-managed, strictly protected areas proliferated to the extreme detriment of indigenous peoples across the world. Indeed, state-managed protected areas pursued under this colonial approach have largely disregarded indigenous land tenure, dispossessed them of their territories, excluded them from accessing their resources and cultural sites, forced them often into abject poverty on the outskirts of their homelands, denied their participation in the conservation and development of their own lands, and criminalized them for merely existing in the places they've always been. That's not to say that all protected areas violate the rights of indigenous peoples. In fact, there's a number of protected areas, albeit a small percentage, that are actually governed by indigenous peoples themselves. What I'm concerned about in this presentation is this rather prevalent but outdated approach to nature conservation, which seeks to safeguard biodiversity by evicting the inhabitants of these territories, usually indigenous peoples or other land-dependent communities, excluding these groups indefinitely or curtailing their usage rights, and enforcing protected area boundaries through heavily aggressive and militarized approaches. Now, to be sure, indigenous peoples have long resisted and challenged the negative impacts of these protected areas on their lands and livelihoods. The full force of that resistance was on display more than 20 years ago now at the International Union for Conservation of Nature's 5th World Parks Congress in 2003. At that time, 120 indigenous representatives provided a forceful rebuke of the prevailing conservation model, as well as the power brokers who were enabling it and promoting it. This quite famous quote on the slide here was made by indigenous representatives during that World Parks Congress. And it, among other things, sought to convey that nature conservation, at least in their view, was just the latest iteration in a broader colonial project designed to oppress indigenous peoples and dispossess them of their territories. One of the outcomes of the 5th World Parks Congress was a recommendation for the creation of a Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is a signature mechanism in the field of transitional justice. This is the text of the original recommendation that was adopted in 2003. More recently, during the IUCN's World Conservation Congress in 2021, a motion was adopted that requested that the IUCN establish a working group on truth and reconciliation. So this is an idea that continues to have some purchase in global conservation circles, and while no such truth commission has been established, there is this growing recognition that just and rights-based conservation is being hampered by legacies of past violations, and that some level of historical address is necessary to protect the rights of indigenous peoples, but also to safeguard biodiversity. And even mainstream conservation actors, such as the large global conservation organizations, have started to invoke the rhetoric of transitional justice in their own messaging about how they are to do conservation on indigenous territories. Despite this, there hasn't been much of a serious attempt to think through the value of transitional justice or engage with some of its limitations in this context. I was curious to study whether such an endeavor aligned with the theoretical underpinnings of the transitional justice field and the transitional justice project. Transitional justice I've been talking about for quite a while, but I haven't provided a definition. There isn't a consensus singular definition. The most cited one comes from the UN Secretary General from 2004, which sets forth, the full range of processes and mechanisms associated with a society's attempts to come to terms with large-scale abuses. And of course, memorialization is now considered a core pillar of transitional justice, and museums obviously have an incredibly important part to play in this realm in addressing violent and difficult histories. But as originally conceived and implemented, transitional justice certainly did not envision tackling the types of large-scale harm inherent in establishing protected areas on indigenous territories. And there's a concern shared by many that broadening the scope of transitional justice risks some level of conceptual coherence, basically turning it into a theory of everything, and potentially undermining the entire project. I would suggest, however, that confronting and addressing the harms associated with colonial conservation through a transitional justice lens is actually conceptually justified, even if you're looking at dominant mainstream transitional justice theory. And there's a bit of divergence in experts here, but there are two main criteria that tend to differentiate transitional justice from so-called ordinary forms of justice. The first being that transitional justice responds to large-scale abuses, not isolated instances of wrongdoing. And second, most authors and scholars tend to agree that it requires the presence of a bona fide transition. I'll talk about kind of what that means in a bit. I think that the first prong, the large-scale harm, is easily satisfied in the case of colonial conservation. Estimates vary, but studies show that millions of people have been displaced from their territories over thousands of protected areas globally. So we're, at a global level, we're certainly talking about large-scale harm and not isolated acts of violence. And even at a country level, the scope of harm is immense. I think there was a study in India from 2020 that showed that from 1988, there was 67 protected areas to, I think, 2020, there was 870 protected areas in that country, resulting in the displacement of upwards of 14,000 families. So we're certainly talking about large-scale harm on par with other transitional justice cases. The issue of whether that it's supported by a discernible transition is a bit trickier, I would say. Transitional justice was originally theorized in the context of two very specific transitions, one being authoritarian states moving to some sort of liberal democracy, and then two, states moving from armed conflict to peace. That was the paradigmatic cases of transitional justice, but I think it's fair to say that the field has undoubtedly moved beyond them in many ways, including in this country to some extent, offering a certain level of flexibility to how we conceptualize a transition. And in the context of colonial conservation, I think it's clear that what I would call the conservation industry, states, intergovernmental organizations, NGOs, scientists, consultants, they're arguably undergoing a type of transition that could support a transitional justice response, particularly in the form of a sort of indigenous rights consciousness that started to develop among conservation stakeholders. This indigenous rights consciousness is evidenced by a growing acceptance, at least rhetorically, that indigenous peoples are central to conservation and cannot be ignored, much less evicted. And while rights-based conservation is certainly in its initial stages, it's at its nascence, indigenous peoples are indeed controlling, governing, owning more and more protected areas that are established on their territories. And in my view, this signals the type of gradual, albeit uncertain and incomplete transition that can conceptually support the application of transitional justice in this context. Now, beyond these theoretical justifications, there's also important pragmatic reasons to reckon with colonial conservation in more meaningful ways. I'll just mention one of them because I'm rapidly running out of time, and that's just the potential knock-on effect for nature, right? It's commonly accepted that indigenous peoples are the top custodians of their environment. They represent 5% of the global population, but they own, manage, and control 25% of the land on this earth. They are already disproportionately affected by protected areas. 50% of them are established on their territories. But also there's a high percentage of remaining biodiversity on indigenous territories. So they have an incredibly important role to play. Addressing grievances and past violations through a transitional justice process could help integrate indigenous peoples into conservation management in more meaningful ways, with the likely benefit of realizing better environmental outcomes. Now, I want to just spend the last minute or two that I have on talking about what I call the land problem. It's the most significant dilemma with respect to applying the tools and frameworks of transitional justice to colonial conservation. Indigenous peoples displaced through conservation largely center their demands around the restitution of their lands. And land restitution is a well-acknowledged form of reparation under international law. At the same time, it's been an elusive goal of transitional justice processes, and in general, land issues are generally weakly integrated into transitional justice agendas and policy. It's also often seen as impossible to restitute stolen indigenous land. That's even reflected in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which contemplates the potential impossibility of this and provides an alternative. There's also a question of who the land should be returned to. Right? That's obviously not clear in many cases. We're talking about intergenerational harm. We need to be worked through on a practical level. But regardless, there seems to be a basic lack of political will among states to engage in this type of mass land restitution. And we can see that even in the lack of implementation of human rights judgments. Absent restitution, there's a risk that transitional justice measures, including museum work, may distract from broader reforms around land and around decolonization. And that's a point that's been made by numerous indigenous scholars and activists. I don't think that necessarily abrogates the value of transitional justice in this context, but it does demonstrate that it really is just one part of the larger project of addressing injustice and resolving conflict in societies. And for that reason, I argue that it warrants quite a modest, cautious approach, whereby transitional justice mechanisms can serve as one tool in tandem with other avenues of redress and reform. But I will stop there, cognizant of the time, and I can obviously pick up on anything in the Q&A.
Thank you. Moltes gràcies. Moltes gràcies per la intervenció que ha estat.
Thank you very much for your presentation, and you also were keeping strictly to the time assigned. Let's keep the discussion, the questions and answers for the end, because there might be some further questions arising after the next presentation, so there might be more interesting counter questions after the next presenter. So if you think that's fine, let's wait until the end. And I would like to give the floor now to Josep Reyné.
Bé, Josep Reyné.
Josep Maria Reyné Vergeli will speak about the Ikunde, the Center of Animal Acclimatization and Experimentation in the Spanish Guinea, research and exotic animals, the trafficking of exotic animals and exotic plants, and ethnological and exotic ethnological objects. He works for the Barcelona University and the Autonomous Barcelona University. He's a member of the Institute of History of Science at the Autonomous University of Barcelona, and is also working in the Center of Animal Acclimatization and Experimentation, Ikunde. And he was also settling in the Spanish Guinea colony, where thousands of ethnological objects were taken to be included in the museum. So this is a project framed within the history of the different the zoo, the history of the zoo of Barcelona, and the different museums and centers of exotic plants and animals in Barcelona. Thank you. Good afternoon. In my presentation, I would like to talk about Ikunde Center, as it was said, which is a research station It was owned by the City Council of Barcelona, and it was managed by the zoo. It was located near Bata, in the continent region of the Spanish Guinea, as the African territories are known, which used to be a former Spanish colony. Ikunde was working from mid-1958 till February 1969, where the center was abandoned because of the independization process, the independence process from the colony. Antoni Jordi Cuspinera directed the project of the Barcelona Zoo between 1955 and 1985. In that period, the Barcelona Zoo was transformed, and it went from an old-fashioned small zoo with just a few animals to a place which was still in bad state because of the consequences of the Spanish Civil War, to a bigger zoo, more modern and internationally renowned, including hundreds of updated animals, with one of the best dolphin centers in the world. And the main icon of the Barcelona Zoo was the albino gorilla called Copito de Nieve, or Snowflake. It worked alongside with the Franco dictatorship regimes, promoting those narratives. And it was a public showcase of the regime, locally and nationally. In the post-war period, in an autarky context, the Franco regime promoted the exhibition of its African possessions. One of its goals was to obtain what they could not obtain in the international markets. Contrarily to the metropolis, the post-war in Guinea was a period of economic boom in which a lot of Catalan companies took part, which was fed by the arrival of the colonies in the peninsula. The main economic lobby in Guinea was organized through the House of the Spanish Guinea, La Casa de la Guinea Española, created in 1941 with central office in Barcelona. The most numerous group of Spanish citizens in Guinea were Catalans. Fernando Po, in the region of Fernando Po, and in the continental region as well. In Guinea, hunters were established. A lot of them were foreigners who were trading with animals, with their furs, and with all sorts of objects. Also, some of the colonial members or colonizators were hunting, and they were acquiring animals, objects, and trading with them. Moreover, scientific expeditions were organized through the Institute of African Studies. At the end of the 40s, Young was teaching on natural science in the official middle school in the town of Granollers, organizing outings to nature and the countryside with the students, including a visit to the Barcelona Zoo. And he also got in touch with Dr. Ignasi Barraquer, who was also involved in the project. Barraquer included Young in a group of sponsors who wanted to work for these projects. But some businessmen had interests in Guinea, like Riera Marsan. In the framework of the Friends of the Zoo, the idea was launched to acquire animals from Guinea to provide the Barcelona Zoo Park. In the context of colonial domination and with the pressure of this group, the city council started considering the possibility of buying animals from Guinea, with the goal of organizing a trip to Guinea. In order to study those possibilities on the ground, the city council ordered young an economic and technical report in which the possibilities of buying those animals was dealt with, as well as objects and plans. For the City Council of Barcelona, for the zoo, and for the Service of Plants and Gardens, as well as for the Ethnological Museum. In this report, the possibility of purchasing those animals was dealt with, and the need was established to adapt the situation of those animals in captivity, modifying their food, and to prepare them for the long trip to Barcelona. For this purpose, the General Direction of Colonies gave a piece of land to the City Council in Guinea, about 15 kilometers from Baza, very close to the Bingung town. Jonge wrote that report with the information that he had found in different publications of the time. The information that he was given by John Aina de las Arte and two other friends from childhood friends who were living in Guinea. I would like to mention Agustí Lorenzo y Gracia, who participated in this project. Lorenzo lived in Baza, working in a transport company. Lorenzo established contact with people residing in the area, trading with animals, whether they would be African people or Americans or Germans, and he started acquiring the necessary knowledge to obtain those animals that he was buying from the local population, and he would adapt them to captivity conditions, and they would later send them to Granollers. And between 1992 and 1994, Young was receiving the delivery of animals. Lorenzo was sending them through Domine, regular lines by ship between Domini and Guinea. They had sailors and who took care of the animals during the trip. Young dedicated these animals to his personal collection. Young and Lorenzo demonstrated that the theoretical idea to provide the zoo with wild animals in Guinea was feasible and it could benefit the institution. The success of the project favored Young's position in the zoo management. That helped him position himself as the best candidate as a manager. He then proceeded to exchange some information on animals and objects of natural sciences, organizing conference about the possibilities that Guinea was offering to provide for those museums. Where the place as a museum curator was out, he ensured that the members of the jury and that the people working there knew that his project was a success and that he had animals in his own house. The bid was done in the beginning of 1955, and Young was named a provisional manager. At the beginning of the 50s, the La Saleta brothers were dedicated to hunting and the sales and purchase of animals, and they were living very close to Guinea. In 1953, Lluís got in touch with Lorenzo in order to test the possibilities that he could have to establish some business with animal trade. In 1974, he traveled to Guinea, and he got to know Lorenzo. Young and Lorenzo started doing business with La Saleta, and Young started sending animals from Douala. In 1955, La Saleta established himself in Guinea, in a land near Bata, in Ikunde, and in exchange for offering a small animal park, it seems that La Saleta was receiving certain favors by the governor in the colony's animal trade. In 1997, an agreement was signed between La Saleta and the zoo about the purchase of a great number of animals, valued in around €1 million. La Saleta became the main provider of animals for the Barcelona Zoo. Once the management of the zoo was sorted out, the city council started taking possession of the Bindung land, which was given for free by the Department of Colonies. Eduardo Fuentes y Martín was the person in charge of doing this, as together with Agustí Pañella y Gómez, director of the Ethnological Museum. 1956, this certificate was signed. And with this concession, there were special conditions limiting the conditions of the Acclimatization park, because it didn't allow the exchange of animals or the sales of those animals to other parks. These conditions were probably consequences of the commitments acquired by the government of the colony with La Saleta. La Saleta died at the end of 1957 with the authorization of the city council with the objective of studying this acclimatization park. Young traveled to Guinea together with Pañella and Lluís Riudó, the managing director of the Service of Parks and Gardens. In that trip, the Ikunde activities started, and the first contacts were done with the La Saleta inheritors, who they received an offer to sell the Ikunde headquarters and the center. For the management of the center, Jordi Sabaté P. was hired, who had been living in Guinea for years, and he had an experience in the management of agricultural exploitations in the area. Although he lacked academical studies, Sabaté dedicated himself to anthropology and natural sciences, and he collaborated with Paella and did several publications on the fan population and sent various objects for the Ethnological Museum. During the preparation of the center, Paella suggested the post as a manager for him, and they also established some collaborations with some German and North American researchers who did some studies on chimpanzees. Sabaté established a network of relationships with the local population, which enabled him to carry out some ethnological research and to buy and sell objects, which he used also to establish international relationships. These are examples. And the anthropologist Harry Shapiro was directing the American Museum of Natural History of New York, or George Chapin, curator of this same museum. To him, hundreds of specimens of this local bird were sent. The Ikunde structure was reproducing the colonial structure. The management was at the hands of Sabaté, and the other staff were Africans. This center was started in precarious conditions. At the beginning, Sabaté didn't even have a contract or any wages, and he had to do some taxidermy, hunting mainly primates, selling the skulls and skeletons. This activity was kept once the center started working. and it meant it was considerable income. The main goal of the center was to provide for gorillas for the Barcelona Zoo and to maintain the animals in the center, but the main source were local hunters to whom he would buy the captured animals. Sabaté was using his contact networks to obtain the animals obtained by Young in Barcelona, also plants and objects for the Ethnological Museum. One of the hunters, the local hunters, was Benito Mania, who later captured Snowflake, the albino gorilla, and he sold it to Sabaté. In 1972, the activities in the center were moved to the Ikunde territory, where Lasaeta had his equipment, and that was the final headquarters of the center. Ikunde is an example of the exploitation of the colony resources in the period of the Franco dictatorship, and an example of a close link between colonialism and scientific research, especially in zoology, biology, and ethnology. Ikunde combined the hunting of animals with the exchange, trade, and conservation. Ikunde was participating in expeditions as well, zoological expeditions, ethnological expeditions, from which some publications, some relevant publications were a result. The Goliath frog, gorillas, chimpanzees were objects of studies, and also anthropological studies on the Fang ethnical group, and archaeological excavations were also done. In 1975, National Geographic Society was contacted, inviting, they were contacted by the institute, and he was invited to take part in the Turing University by Arthur Riopyle, a well-known primatologist. With arrival of Snowflake in the Barcelona Zoo, gave the Barcelona Zoo the possibility to become a part of international research. Together with Young, with different trips to study Snowflake, Sabaté came back to Africa, turned into a primatologist and anthropologist, expert in study of the field with international first-hand studies, together with Chapiro, Colin Brooks, and Desmond Clark, and the archaeologist, and the primatologist Craig Lang, Osman Hill, and others. Sabaté was a very important scientist, a leader in the introduction of ethnology in Spain. His work was relevant, especially on the Rio Muni chimpanzees, on the use of tools that was parallelly done to Jane Goodard's works or research. One of the interests, as a conclusion, one of the interests and which are coinciding in the Barcelona Zoo and the Franco regime brought about the colonization of these territories to exploit the resources that were offered there. The Ikunde Center, adorned with the name of the supposed scientific neutrality, was providing animals to the zoo, plants to the service of plants and gardens, and ethnological objects to the Ethnological Museum of Barcelona. Ikunde is an example of these practices. These practices of expoliation, pillaging, and sacking, where animals and objects were sent not only to Spain but also all around Europe. With the help of Lorenzo, Young demonstrated that it was possible to obtain animals, wild animals from Guinea, and that the project could benefit the zoo. This project was used to position himself as the main candidate as the zoo director. Ikunde is also an example of a close link between colonialism and science, especially in fields such as zoology, anthropology, or ethology. Thank you very much for your attention. So after this interesting communication, we will give the floor to Martina Muñoz, Ramon, and Celeste Muñoz. So the title of this presentation is Colonial Collections at the Natural Science Museums and their Traceability. Martina Muñoz Ramon is working at the University of Barcelona, and she is studying master's degree in ethnography in the Autonomous University of Barcelona, and she's part of a project, Africans, and she's working on the provenance research on a part of the Victor Balaguer collection and the collection of Filipino specimens of the Museum of Natural Sciences of Barcelona. We also have Celeste Muñoz Martínez, professor of the Department of History, Contemporaneous History of the UNED University, doctor in Society and Culture by the University of Barcelona. She has been an associate professor in the same university and a collaborator professor in the UOC University, where she has been teaching on the history of Africa. Her main lines of research are African studies, with a particular focus on the systems of colonization and the legal plurality in the Equatorian Guinea, as well as reparation and historical legacy. The project Traffickers has been one of her main projects, working on the provenance research in Equatorial Guinea. As we said, the two of them are collaborators of this Trafficants project. And in this museum, a great part of the provenance research for this project have been made known, and they are collaborators of the museum, therefore. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, Joyce, for your kind invitation, and we're here to explain this project that you were mentioning, this project called Trafficants. And I think it's very timely because precisely this communication is very much related to some of the questions pointed by Colin during his presentation. It's also related to one of the sections related to Ikunde. So without dwelling in explaining what is the meaning of the project, Trafficants tries to study and problematize within the framework of the existing discussion of colonial patrimony, is studying the origin of the different collections of 6 museums. Museums that you can see in the presentation. Among them we have the Ethnological Museum and Culture of the World, the Museum of Natural Sciences, the Victor Balaguer Museum of Villanova, the Museum of the Skin of Igualada, and the one of Vic and Banyolas, besides the Jordi Sabater Peak found. I'm not going to spend much time explaining all the gamification of the project and its phases, but Martina and myself would like to focus on the part of the provenance research, which approaches the traceability of many of these objects in the museums, meaning the provenance research, which try to establish a more exhaustive traceability of some of the objects that we have as part of these collections. And this will allow us to build a much more precise contextualized knowledge of these pieces in order to better evaluate aspects such as the transformation of the museum discourses or the eventual restitution. If they have to be transformed, the museum discourses or historical justice such as restitution or other actions related to this patrimony. In fact, one of the main challenges in addressing the question of the restitution or resignification of collection is the lack of information about the origin and absence of many of these objects and the absence of historization around these pieces. questions such as who was the producer, where do these pieces come from, who was the collector, what was the purpose for the creation of the object, which was the context when it was acquired, the different dominations operating in that context, which actors were involved in its acquisition, local and colonial actors, which were the consequences of this patrimony, what are the present consequences of this patrimony, and how did the object arrive at the museum, and what was its history within the institution. These are some of the questions that are asked when we try to explore each one of these pieces. Starting from the premise that it is difficult to act on the ignorance that operates on these collections. And the main challenge was, on the one hand, once we have chosen the museums that we have studied, to locate the inventories of the amount of pieces that we are approaching, which pieces are under the custody of some of these museums, and placing them in front of thousands of pieces acquired during colonization in Africa and also the Philippines, which are the territories that we have approached during our study. And once we had the X-ray of these collections, of these museums, what we wanted to do was to make a sampling of these pieces, which is quite problematic and can be debated, in order to study in depth the context of some of these pieces. Having said this, having placed our project within the context, this study of provenance and the research, I tried to place some of the examples of this part which is related to the environmental aspects of our project. Among the different museums that we have chosen, we have to make an important distinction between those that belong to natural sciences, those containing specimens, and those which have ecologic, artistic, or historical patrimony. This boundary which exists, which poses some problems, is quite permeable, and this has led us to discuss our own methodologies applied to these collections that raises specific challenges when dealing with specimen collections during colonization periods, and this is the question that will be approached by Martina during our conclusions. I want to point to the fact that in the museums of natural sciences, taxidermia, when we have made this sampling, and these are some criteria that can be discussed, we have taken into account that some pieces allow us to deal with multiple subjects, including scientific discourses on nature and landscape, and the domination of nature and landscape, and the environmental consequences of these collecting and hunting activities, which led to the extinction of some species. In fact, in the slide, you can take a look at the process of the pieces of the Museum d'Arde of Banyoles. We have studied a couple of pieces, the Museum of Natural Sciences, which has had much more importance within natural sciences and taxidermy, and we have chosen 27 pieces from Philippines, Morocco, and Guinea, and 2 pieces from the Museum of Igualada. We have chosen a couple of pieces, which is a gorilla leg, an elephant leg, and those pieces are the ones that I want to explain during the second part of my conference. And this is the research that we have developed at the Museum of Igualada, and these are the 2 pieces that I was pointing to, the elephant leg, paw, and the gorilla paw. Through the inventories, when we started to do some research at the Museum of Igualada, the Museum of La Noya, we revisited the inventories, and we saw that the African collection was made by 110 pieces, of which we identify 33 potential ones for our study, 21 from Morocco and 12 from Guinea. And it is important to make this precision. And this Museum of Igualada, it's a regional, small museum dedicated to leather. And this museum, maybe we should not approach or speak about the Museum of Leather of Igualada. But despite being a small and regional museum, It had a colonial section in the 50s and the 60s, and it was promoted, and this is what we consider interesting, by Jordi Sabater Pi, a central figure who is linked to this museum and institution. It's a central character related to many other museums which are related to this Trafficants project. Initially, the study of these pieces, the Museum of Leather of Igualada, we had chosen the collections from Morocco, but sometimes research leads you to other options and you go one way, you don't find anything, you cannot complete the knowledge already existing on a certain piece, so we had to discard, continuing with the study of this collection. And then we focus on redirecting the attention to Guinean pieces provided by Jordi Sabater Pi himself, and among the different pieces that he sent to the museum, Jordi Sabater Pi, we chose this elephant paw and this gorilla skin for several reasons, because we found documents on these pieces and also because these were two species on the brink of extinction, and we had to apply policies of environmental protection at the moment they were acquired. In order to make the traceability of these studies, the first thing we did was an in-depth study of the inventories and documentation of the institution, and then some contrast research, trying to look for other sources, such as regional archives. Sabater Pi found the AGA and the newspaper library, which we study, and which gave us some fragmentary sources that we had never approached, but once we put them together, they help us to place this object in a historical context of acquisition of the piece, and also the environmental legislation study and the colonial context and the contracts with scientific literature. If we take a look at the gorilla skin, and this is the piece I would refer during the final part of my intervention, through the museum itself and the information given by the museum, the one they had, in fact, is that they knew the date of entry, 1957, and they knew it was a donation from Jordi Sabater Pi and coming from the Spanish Guinea. And we didn't have any more data given by the institution, but from the contrast of different sources and archives and these fragmented sources that allow you to move forward towards some conclusions, and with some axes that I would like to mention here, such as the history of the specimen, the museum history, and the interpretation context. Very quickly, through correspondence, we were able to situate the study of this specimen in a more profound way. This correspondence, which belongs to the archive of Jordi Sabater Pi, told us about the history of the story and how the Museum of the Leather of Igualada was important to this story that Antoni Llong, August Panyella, Sabater Pi, and Lluís Salaleta had provided, and everything around the Bingdung Acclimatization Center, the Ikunde Center I was referring to before. And in fact, thanks to this archive, we knew that the gorilla was hunted and killed by Lluís Salaleta. And that year, he had become an animal supplier at the Barcelona City Council. So we were able to expand on the history of the object. The life of the object, the history of the museum, how the skin was exhibited for the first time at the stand of the guild in the exhibition Palace of Barcelona, 1958, and the newspapers reflected on that, the press of that time, talking about the scientific discourses of some exotic species and how this was also retrofitting on the scientific discourses on these species and their imaginary. Also the context of acquisition, being able to expand it and explain it better, and how in this context of acquisition we have been able to approach how under the discourses of the scientific purposes. Some institutions and people were able to benefit from hunting and exploitation of animal species despite the progressive legislative limitation due to the risk of extinction. And the Spanish legislation applying in 1953, the legislation from 1932, and they were creating natural spaces and at the same time were limiting or projecting the creation of these parks. And she will explain later, and it was limiting also the acquisition of these animals, gorillas or elephant, only with scientific purposes. And within this interruption, they were able to acquire this specimen. And through the administration, we have been able to study the actors that were operating in this activity and the role played by this network of relationships that we have explained around the Ikunde garden. And finally, from this explanation and information, we were able to place an interpretation framework, which will be developed during the conclusion, which is from the history of the piece, being able to know the environmental impact of colonialism and the effects of natural exploitation for the benefit of private people. And these pieces are exhibited, but within a context taking into account this dimension. Gorillas as a species suffer setback during colonial activities due to these activities and also because of massive deforestation associated to this business. And at the heart of all this, we have to place a business and institutional activity that allow people to get rich with the exploitation of these specific resources of the colony. And now I would like to give the floor to my colleague Martina to continue with this explanation.
The second collection of our analyzed specimens collection, you can see them on the screen on the slide, were collected by Lluís el Cotarro through the Royal Academy of Arts and Sciences in Barcelona. We found out that the date of his stay we don't know. There's a lack of information about the specimens, but we have constructed the first theory of the collection through the history contextualizations of the Filipino archipelago. So there was this first need to get to know the specimens from the social framework where they came from. Most of the specimens we know are coming from the Filipino island of Luzon. What was the historical context at the end of the 19th century? Despite the presence of over 200 years of Spain in the Philippines, there were some islands not controlled by the colonial Spanish government. There were two, in the north, the Brunel Island, and the area of the Luzon Island, which is the part that is interesting to us. This last one was characterized by the scarce presence of the Spanish military at the end of the 19th century. The first scientific expeditions took place. The attempts of control were in vain, and some military campaigns were started in the 19th century with the aim to submit the indigenous peoples in the region of the Luzon Island. During the 19th century, 75 military expeditions were sent to the area, called the campaigns of pacification. These pacification campaigns mainly had two goals: the missionary and colonization project and the creation of provinces and governments, political military governments, and the institutionalization of the territory and therefore its control. The extraction, study, and commercialization of natural studies on the territory, in this case of specimens, was possible thanks to the violence, the colonial violence of the conquerors, giving free rein to the looting and pillage of the territories and leaving it open as a laboratory also for aficionados and more people who could try to do this more as a leisure activity. The museums might explain that violence against the indigenous peoples or the local populations was the factor that made possible the keeping and collection of those objects. The second exposition is coming from Morocco. The collections from Morocco were the fruit of this first scientific expeditions in the mid-19th century, 1959, Fernando Wilder, the head of military the sanitary service, started the herborizations in Morocco. The integration of naturalists in this process, in this colonization process, was progressive. The institutional impulse was produced from the Spanish Society of Natural History. In 1905, the Commission for the Exploration in the Northeast of Africa was created by the Spanish Society of Natural History. The first photography was a bird, a gach in Catalan, which was collected by Pius Fontiquer, doctor in pharmacy in Ceuta Casdir in 1932, in an expedition organized by the Spanish Society of Natural History. This small bird was collected in the 1932 expedition. The goal was to carry out an exhaustive study of the flora and fauna of the Beniceyel area. According to the Fontiquer narrative, they came out of Barcelona. They left Barcelona in June 1932 and arrived in Chauen 4 days later, where they went around with local guides until they reached Ceuta Casdir, and then they went for Baptazar, also with local guides. They went to the Ceuta Casdir mountain, where the camp was installed, and the great part of those specimens were collected during that time, the ones that are registered. What was the role that the museums of natural sciences are playing in this provenance research? This question we can think about looking at the genesis of the museums and the background of the museums during most of the 19th century. The study of natural history was focused on this, and with the expansion of imperialism and the colonial powers, social anthropology acquired a greater importance, with the creation of museums dedicated to collections, which was defined the natural collection of humanity. So at the end of the 19th century, the museum was divided into two. On the one side, museums portraying nature, and on the other side, the cultural heritage, fruit of those colonial encounters. Differently from other ontologies, according to the Western ontology, nature is presented as an external reality to the human being. Historically, in the Western context, this has been interpreted uniquely as a source of economical resources. Therefore, its quantification, numerization, and classification has become something fundamental within the process of capital accumulation. Within this framework, science, understood as an authorized system, has become the tool to conquer and plunder nature. A part of the colonial project. Colonial meaning without the participation, also meaning without the participation of science. This has not been an arbitrary process. On the opposite, these processes have been key, which have brought taken power away from science. Natural science museums are not neutral spaces. The scientificist discourse has made it possible to imagine colonialist landscapes and the reconstruction of landscape with a domination of the hegemonic discourses of the time. So the specimens make it visible that there is a recollection of museum, and makes it go hand in hand with the violent histories in those places. Also, the classification of the museum. annihilating the local knowledges. So this exotization through the cultural construction of a landscape becomes a domination of the epoch discourses. Classification, taxonomization, and capturing of territories and specimens are annihilating ontologies and non-Western knowledges. Also, environmental legacy means to analyze those legacies in terms of reparation beyond the revision of the ways of classification and contextualization, bearing in mind the local knowledges of the origin territories and the colonial violence in the context of acquisition. These legacies are linking us with environmental debates and the ecological consequence of colonialisms. And we need to delve deeper into how these activities transform landscape and the ecology of the period and its territorial impact. Deforestation, increase of illnesses, by zoonose extinction, etc. Thank you. Our next presentation is Paula Serafini. Serafini. Paula Serafini is a senior lecturer in creative and cultural industries at Queen Mary University of London. Her research is focused on the fields of cultural policies, and her interests include extractivism, social movements, cultural work, activism, artistic activism, and socio-ecological transitions. Her works are including performance action in the ecosocial crisis, art and ecology, politics, together with Gabriela Melinsky, Laxo 2020, and Creating Worlds, collective action and post-extractivism by the University Press in 2022. Are you ready, Paula? Hello. I will read it in Spanish, but the slides are in English. This presentation that I'd like to share with you is maybe expanding the field about how we understand controversies around colonialism and the ecosocial crisis in the environment of museums. And it is based on activism experiences and research experiences in London and particularly in the British Museum. The starting point and the position from which I am telling my story is an activist coalition called Art Not Oil, and this is, I like to stress this. History would maybe be different if it were well told from the perspective of another of the collectives who are part of these actions that I'm going to be showing you. But this is the experience from which I am explaining the story to you, from which I am presenting the story to you. This is an activist campaign against the sponsorship of oil companies to cultural institutions in the United Kingdom. It started in 2004 as a niche campaign saying we don't want oil companies to promote cultural spaces such as the British Museum, the Royal Shakespeare Company, or other museums in London. In 2013, it became a coalition of different activist groups or activism of varied profiles. Some were contemporary arts and collectives, some others were more extractive, more other profiles. So the promotion of arts were at the heart of the campaigns, but it became a more intersectional campaign later, and this is why I think it's an interesting campaign to share with you today. But before anything else, why sponsorship of arts? Why is it important? There is a concept that I don't know how you call it in Spanish. In English, it's art washing. And there is a book by Evans, published in 2015, called Art Washing, saying that basically what oil companies do, or tobacco companies, or arms companies, is promoting sports events, cultural spaces, or other things in order to obtain social licenses to operate. And this would be giving some money in exchange for my logotypes on the programs, on the walls, and I will look like an organization that cares for nature, arts, and sports, a good citizen, let's say. Some people have studied this, and it's a good business for these companies. It's part of their corporate social responsibility strategy, and it's not a true philanthropic act. It's a strategy in order to obtain social support that will make them easier to get political support and things such as lobbying, concessions, the winning of bids, or lowering taxes or other incentives that companies can obtain. So this is a strategy of So our campaign is aimed at these kind of companies, mainly oil companies, and it's an environmental campaign, but it also exposes other kinds of human rights violations which are linked to the actions of these oil companies. The group I would like to speak specifically about is BP or not BP, coming from the famous Shakespeare sentence, to be or not to be, because the group started off as a group of friends in England who went to watch some Shakespeare plays, a middle-class group of friends who went to see the Royal Shakespeare Company to watch some Shakespeare, and they saw that it was sponsored by BP. So they were wondering, what does BP have with this? So they started jumping on stage before the theater play started and started doing mini sketches where they would take Shakespearean sentences or parts of plays, and they would change the content of it in order to speak about BP, and they would end up saying out with a logotype, and they would cut in a very dramatic action, would cut the logotype out of the brochures, and that became a larger network of people, and eventually they changed their main office to the British Museum, to the head offices. In the British Museum brought in itself some challenges and opportunities. In aesthetical terms, performance action were organized in this new space, and organizing this came across difficulties in terms of sound because the space was very big, so it had a new charge of symbols, a new symbolic charge. So we went from Shakespeare to dealing with a new historical space with its own references. Politically, different issues had to be dealt with because this institution has a colonial legacy, which is a symbol of imperialism. But there were also conflicts in the tertiary workers, in the staff, the calls to repatriation of objects, the way the collection was disposed or presented or showcased in the museums. So the answer to this were alliances and collaborations with different collectives, claiming different issues. For example, New Mexico, London New Mexico Solidarity, Rodney Kelly, an Australian activist, and PCS Union, representing the workers in the culture sector. The approach was the following: showing that the different conflicts that were playing out, or struggles playing out at the museum, the British Museum, are connected. Exploitation of the workers, especially migrant workers from ethnical minorities, were directly linked to this imperialist symbol, which is the British Museum, and the destruction that BP is doing in these countries is linked to the process of violence and destruction by which these objects in the British Museum collections were obtained. And the British imperialism nowadays is being reproduced through the neo-colonial dynamics by British companies such as British Petroleum. So these were the narratives and arguments that were developed through this new space and through the collaborations with groups in the United Kingdom, but also groups in other parts of the world who sometimes travel to England, for example, to carry out legal cases, like suing particular specific cases. I would like to mention some of the collectives with which we work. For example, Ronnie Kelly and Bunalori, who are claiming to get an artifact back from the British Museum. It is a star, and it's a shield, a wooden shield. It's called the Wiggle Shield, which is reminding us of the first contact between the settlers and the Australian Aborigines. The museum gave different excuses why they wouldn't give it, because the conservation conditions were such and such. But then directly what they said was, we're not sure that this is the original piece. We think maybe this is just a copy. So you claiming for it is not valid. So they're just changing the defense strategy all the time. London Mexico Solidarity is a group of Zapatista solidarity based in London, and an action was carried out with them after the Sinapa massacre that was politically covered. What happened was BP was celebrating a Day of the Dead event at the British Museum, but this event was aimed at bringing the Mexico ambassador together with corporate representatives from BP to sign an agreement for an exploitation project in Mexico. This was BP and BP with London Mexico Solidarity came together to demonstrate at the British Museum to denounce these violations of human rights and environmental destruction practices. Gilberto Torres was a trade unionist from Colombia who was kidnapped and tortured by the paramilitary working for a subsidiary company of BP. And he came to bring BP to the courts, and he brought this legal action, and he was telling his story as well. This is not a theoretical presentation, but I would like to briefly speak about the idea of performance actions, which I develop in my work, which I understand as actions or performances taken from the canons of theater and performance art, but emerging from the context of activism, and which are guided by an ethos, an activist ethos in their processes. So in the way in which decisions are made, in how we think about political impact, how it is articulated with the social groups, how the relationships are managed between the different groups and affected parties. What can a performance action do? It can allow different ways of engaging with the public and bring a petition forward. They can enable artistic participation, which in turn gives place to political participation. So it is both an artistic and a political action. It can also transform the dynamics of a space, such as these groups did in the British Museum. They can raise the sensorial and generate or emotional responses, or call to the emotions of the public or the audience. And they can be strategic in evading repression from the police and gain support from our world publics. I'd like to show you a part of a video about a demonstration, a protest that was organized in 2019 when BP was organizing an exhibition on Syria. in the British Museum, precisely. On Assyria, where a group of Iraqi activists came together to bring this action forward.
No woman. We are here because it is inexcusable for a public museum to be promoting a fossil fuel company in the middle of a climate crisis.
We are here because 16 years ago, the largest mobilization of people across the world took place to protest the Iraq war.
Destroying lives and polluting water equals colonialism. The climate crisis is already destroying homes and lives, and BP is fueling it. The British Museum is complicit in this destruction by accepting BP's sponsorship. Those who are creating the crisis are the least affected by it. We must stand in solidarity with those on the front lines of climate change, resisting it wherever we can. This means dropping BP.
These are the very same sponsors who advocated for the war, which destroyed my homeland and slaughtered my people, all in the name of oil. To BP and to the British Museum, I say, how dare you use my culture and my history as an attempt to hide your colonial skeletons?
As the Iraqis are struggling to find water for their crops or feed their cattle with, the British Museum have partnered up with a company that is not only polluting the waters with waste, but in 2016 and 17 have injected over 720,000 barrels per day of water for their oil production. On this anniversary, it is up to us to remind the British Museum that we will not accept this sponsorship. We refuse to be complicit not only in destruction of our planet, but the exploitation of a people that have done nothing but demand to live their lives in dignity.
In Basra.
Entonces creo que es bastante claro.
So what they tried to do there was to connect the role of BP also with the invasion of Iraq. These kind of actions also pose some limitations and challenges, particularly in the case of this group I'm speaking about. At the beginning of the campaign, there was a difficulty trying to communicate to the public of the museum, which was the main public we were addressing to, why we were taking action against an oil company. A lot of people didn't see them as the ones to blame for human rights violations and climate crisis. Why so specifically oil companies? Why in the context of museums? But this has changed quite a lot, particularly in the United Kingdom, and a lot of these links have been broken. When this campaign started gaining more momentum, the Conservative Party was cutting funds for the arts, for a lot of professionals in the museums, for a lot of people in the public. They would not understand why they would try to cut a sponsorship where sponsors were only giving like a 5% of the sponsoring of museums, where they were getting publicity and advertising in exchange for that. How accessible are these kind of activism? In cultural spaces, even in some cultural spaces are open and free, like in the United Kingdom. In the United Kingdom, there are class barriers, there are physical barriers. So not everyone might feel that these spaces are open. And there are barriers for people who might feel they need to bring forward the protest. They were speaking about colonialism in a cultural space. And why would the police come and arrest us when speaking about art, right, and the possibility to make art in a performance way, also migratory issues, who can protest and who cannot. Another challenge was also that the more layers there was to the issue, trying to connect colonialism with climate change and how we want institutions to work and how we want institutions to be supported in terms of resources, the more complex the narrative becomes and the more challenging to communicate. We tried to base our communications in the visual because of those sound problems, sound issues I was mentioning before. There were also some power imbalances between UK activists and frontline communities in the global south. It is more diverse now, but it is still based in the United Kingdom, people from the United Kingdom who can collaborate with other people from other places, but they are all still the central ones, and the power imbalance remains still. And the last challenge would be the possible or potential replication in other contexts. In the United Kingdom, it works in the sense that there are other sources of support to culture. There is a state that is there to give support to culture in other places. They are depending on corporate sponsorship or private sponsorship, and this dependence is so big that they don't have the choice to make these kind of decisions. Regarding the impact of these actions, well, several institutions dropped their oil sponsorships. Some of them went and they came back. There's still a room with the name BP now. The connections were mentioned, the visibility was given to these different campaigns, thanks to the alliances between groups, and a special space was created in order to talk about the issue of the financing of culture and the governance of culture, discussing the role of cultural institutions in broader process of colonization. And I will leave it here.
Thank you very much. And now, if you want, we could invite the rest of the speakers to come up the ice. What Colin has said, I thought it was super interesting because I believe that in the policies of protection of the environment that we have implemented here, policies protecting the environment a long time ago, creation of a national park, etc. I think we have followed this colonial logic and this cosification of nature, which makes us think that we could do without these populations who depend from these ecosystems. In the National Park of Doñana in Spain, I live not far away from that park, where if we take a look at the history of how this national park was created and all the different political legislations that have been applied in order to protect this space has been always against the population dependent from this park for its survival. They depended on wood, they were walking the paths relating one park and next. But this has been part of the policies of our country, expelling those people. Of course, nothing can be compared to these huge parks that you relate to and the indigenous peoples in your country. But in a way, the logic has been the same. And these spaces, such as the one of Doñana, are private, closed spaces, close to the population. And nowadays some efforts are being made in order to alter this process. But the truth is that the disconnection of these populations from these territories where they had a cultural, sociological involvement, it's difficult to recover. And, well, just to tell you that It's not something that happens only in a world where you have visibly some colonial peoples, but we can find it also in Andalusia, the south of Spain, which is touched by a very specific colonial policy. If you take a look at this Doñana Park, starts with British travelers who went there for hunting and protecting this space.
Yeah, sure. I'll thank you for that comment. I think it's a very astute observation, and one that is kind of glossed over in the sense that we think about protected areas and national parks primarily in other parts of the world, whereas the role that a lot of Western states play in both, as you say, adopting the logic of and the ideologies behind this model of conservation, but also in funding those models elsewhere. It's quite important. And in a prior life, in advocacy, in legal work that I did, we were very much looking at Western European governments and challenging their complicity in the way in which they have adopted and financed these models to not only I talked about indigenous peoples a lot, but you raised a good point in the sense of there's all types of communities that are affected by the way in which we supposedly seek to protect the spaces around us. And I think it's, at its most basic premise, it goes back to the idea of who understands how to protect their environments best. It's the people who live there, who are from there, who have their identities in those places. And to disregard that in any context, whether it's in Andalusia, whether it's in my home country, whether it's in sub-Saharan Africa, I think has had quite, and I think this isn't just me saying it, I think it's the research has shown it's had quite dire environmental consequences. And it's something that we're grappling with today and trying to figure out what needs to be done in order to both conserve biodiversity, mitigate against the adverse impacts of climate change, because of course protected areas aren't just a biodiversity protection mechanism that's one of the most important climate change mitigation tools, but also to protect the rights and livelihoods and identities of the people that live in and around those spaces. So thank you for that comment.
Hola.
Hello again. I would like to ask a question. I think Colin mentioned it, and maybe Paula a little bit. They approach this subject, so it's for the rest of the members of the panel. And it's related to this meeting. This meeting is about reparation, so maybe the other speakers can tell us how they have thought about reparation, so we can justify the title of this meeting and think about these repair policies. Please. Colin has mentioned it, and Martina also, but the rest of the speakers, please. Hello. I think that maybe the rest of the speakers can complete what I'm going to say, but Martina and myself, in our talk, when we framed the project on which we were specifically working on the question of repair, and it was more projected in the question of the enlargement of knowledge of colonial aspects and the specific aspects related to the collections of the different museums in which we are working. The question that without knowledge, without an in-depth knowledge and previous research on each one of these pieces, offering how the acquisition of these objects has been made, the guarantees behind this operation, whether it was plundering, looting, the general context, colonial context, which deem the users to these operations, recognize who manufactured the object or who collected the object. So naming the objects placing the historical context is a very important task. And this is how we've done it, because in these studies of traceability, this information will help us to evaluate these reparation policies. What do we have to do with this subject? We have to change the museography, enlarging the context and providing more information. Maybe this information will offer some tools, and it will tell us about how to translate this information and take into account the colonial information of the museums, or whether these pieces could be an object of restitution and enlarge this knowledge in order to know whether this was a plundering operation, or maybe take a look at the consequences of this heritage and place it in our museums. We are talking about cultural gaps, access to knowledge, patrimony, unequal patrimony. So I think that all this information, which is gathered and helps us to carry out with our research, provides us some tool for the debate. From an environmental justice perspective, we have often mentioned, at least the perception is that, well, not in a very profound way, but people are speaking about the restitution of ethnological objects, which are the consequences of this custody, and therefore, yes, this is a question which belongs to the public debate. But at the Museum of Natural Sciences, due to its characteristics, it's on the margins of these colonial debates. They have their systems of classification, exhibition of the pieces, and of course they have the same origin, which cannot be separated from the process. In this sense, the consequences that have to be placed on the table, consequences for the environmental debate, it's also important, and to relate it to the different formulas of historical consequences of the colonialism. We speak about the species and animals that were massively exploited by the colonialism, and they changed their relationship with the population, they changed the landscape, destruction of different species, the appearance of diseases, deforestation, etc. And some of these species, although it seems that they are far away from this debate, are very much related to these questions. Therefore, I think that they allow us to relate to this framework of repair and the consequences of colonialism. I wanted to add something. In my case, the objective of my research is not, well, the main objective is not the object itself, but the collection of different stories, which in the end are all related. And here is where we have this repair process in the knowledge. And how did we do it? Who did it? Who were the actors? And in what way they acted and reacted and were. And it's important. And in fact, it's the starting point of these repair processes. And in the case of the Zoo of Barcelona, the animals, well, there are no more animals. They're all dead. Therefore, it is true that maybe they do have it. Well, first of all, I wanted to congratulate all the speakers for their excellent presentations, and a question for Paula about the role of this type of activism in museums, sponsorship, etc. I'm not aware of your work, sorry, and the participatory observation that you do in this milieu of protest. Of course, there is another experience and different interests in order to achieve these objectives. I was interested in knowing where do you place yourself and what are the different methodological problems, which is problem of ethnography or no? And a question for Martina and Celeste. How did these 6 museums reacted with this provenance research in order to evaluate and to resist, and how they change their practices? Thank you. Yes. As far as my position, I started working with this group when I was doing my doctorate, and I wanted to do some research on the internal processes of groups doing art and activism. And I started to work with different groups working on different subjects, and this was one I encountered. And I was trying to define my methodology, and I was in line with this idea of militant research, but also recognizing that I had my own interest and research questions that I wanted to recognize. So my way of negotiating from an ethic and political point of view, my role as researcher is that I'm going to do research and I'm going to be very open. I wanted to know about my interest, but also to remain available for these groups for whatever was necessary. Therefore, in many cases, it was to place my body on the different actions or helping to organize whatever was necessary. At the beginning, yes, I was interested from a research point of view, and I ended up as an activist, and I also became part of the process of transformation of the narrative and also the political position of the campaign, together with other people. When the campaign moved to the British Museum. And this is when I started to realize and appreciate the possibilities given by this space and campaign to deal with different systems. And I ended up connecting with movements against fracking in Argentina, in the Patagonia. People came to London, we filmed a video, and I was able to relate it to other aspects I was working on.
And in terms of the question about the collaborations of museums, the Library Museum Víctor de Balaguer, we are analyzing the Filipino collection there. The collaboration has been really good. I'm working with 2 more colleagues, Have you heard me until now?
Mm-hmm.
We are working on these ethnological pieces, and the reception has been really good. The welcome has been very good. And the same with the Museum of Natural Sciences. They have welcomed us very well. It's a different case. We are analyzing specimens at a personal level. It has been a challenge for me. I would have never imagined that specimens could be tracked. So this has been a really nice experience. I would like to thank and launch a small reflection to the participants and the public, and launch as a question to you, the speakers, the presenters today. You exposed clearly that at the end of the 19th century, there was a dissociation between nature anthropology and the natural antithesis of the natural populations in their natural spaces. So, I'm not sure this is addressed to everyone, this question actually. So, how to go back, not to those old time methods, from dominion and power, but how to recognize colonialism, Eurocentricity, violence, but the museums of natural sciences and the anthropology museums, maybe how can they work together more? How can they keep on working on this and on other projects in closer collaboration? Also thinking about natural parks. So Colin, yes, it is also addressed to you. So thinking also of museums of natural sciences, placing the communities of origin at the center of the, or in the front of those collections. Also by carrying out some reparation. And this is a false dichotomy, maybe. This is a false separation which has been instrumentalized clearly in favor of pillage, of looting and plunder. Do you know any examples of good practices in this regard? I haven't given this a deep thought, maybe, but I was thinking about this distinction between ethnological museums and museums of natural sciences. I think one of the reasons for this is the way they are perceived by society. And I think that through different conversations with colleagues, but also workers, the Museum of Banyolas, the Dardel Museum, and others, I'm thinking maybe it is generally taken for granted that a museum of natural sciences cannot be racist because science is neutral. And this is a position that is quite rooted in society. Representations in a history museum or an ethnological museum or art museum can be more problematic according to most people, but a museum of natural sciences seems to be neutral to everyone or to mostly everyone. So this is a culture of a barrier culture in terms of this separation between some museums and others. So there is some task to be carried out in terms of explaining the close link between science, colonization, and not only social sciences, but also medical science and natural science, etc. And this is where collaborations can play an important role between different museums. Collective exhibitions would help us break this separation or this kind of perspective.
Thank you for that that question. I think there are, in my piece, thinking about national parks, protected areas, I get this question a lot about examples of good practice, and there certainly are examples of good practice, where, in particular, the indigenous peoples or local communities that have historical ties to the land in which the protected area is created on are given governance and are able to participate in the operation of that protected area in a self-determined way. And that includes participation in the kind of education around the protected area, the national park. A lot of the national parks have a education element to them, whether they're through museums or otherwise. And even I actually went to Yellowstone National Park not that long ago, and I noticed when you go through and you pay your money to get into the park, you get a little pamphlet now, and it has all this information about the park. But in very tiny writing at the very bottom, there's an acknowledgement that this land was indeed occupied by various Native American nations, which seems like a very small thing. It certainly is insufficient as far as, we're talking about reparative work. But I think it's worth acknowledging at least that it was not the case even a few years ago. And to the extent that whether they're kind of educational centers, museums, to the extent that they're partnering with indigenous peoples in more meaningful ways, where it's not, it's not this relationship where they bring indigenous peoples or local communities in at the end, but they're actually at the forefront in the design, in the implementation of these projects. That could go a long way, I think, in creating a governance system that, I think about it from a lawyer's perspective because I'm a lawyer, right? And so indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination under international law. The closer that, institutions get to adhering to this inherent right to self-determination, participation, consultation, governance, I think the closer we'll get to, it's a small, but it's an important step towards kind of a reparative action, and one that puts particularly the people and communities who are best placed to protect these lands in a position where they can do that.
I would like to add there is a limit to this question. What is reparation? It depends on who you speak to. The affected communities, on the interested communities, are not all the same. So reparation might not be enough. A specific reparation cannot be enough for a specific community. The cultural contexts are different in different cases, and institutions have different impacts in different places. So just bearing this in mind, I think it's important. So these answers don't necessarily come from this side. So they can come mainly from the other sides, from themselves. That could be a good first step to let them have a say in giving an answer to this. I would like to thank you all because it was very interesting, everything you explained. I don't know if what I will say will make sense, but I don't know much about rewilding, but I have heard about it. So this might be reparation, but alongside with nature and affecting the people living in it as well. So this is something that is being done in some places, but I feel that nature is being restituted in some way, and things can be restituted in the way, but they are, in some way, they are falling into the old same traps of separating people. I'm not an expert, but I just thinking, just made me think of this. The other thing I wanted to say is, I just started working on a scholarship with the equality team with the Institute of the Sciences of the Sea, of Sciences of the Ocean, and a whole rhetoric of commitment with society has been taken. But all we're doing so far just meeting with the heads of research to see how these social dimensions are being introduced. So we are coming to realize that there really isn't, I mean, there is a lot that you need to see yet, but it's like a lot of research is done in the Arctic area, but the same old locations end up being reproduced in these colonial relationships. And I just need to talk to more people who are working in this. But what I'm seeing so far is that there is a certain rhetoric. Nevertheless, the old patterns are being reproduced again and again. So how to incorporate these new dimensions? How, and some people will say that at the end, they will think about it in a sense of transference. So they won't think that what they are doing will have an impact on the people involved in this. Sorry, I'm not explaining very well, but they have a certain rhetoric, but they are still reproducing this colonialism. It's just things I have in my mind. Maybe Colin has something to say about this. If he knows about if you know about rewilding, I don't know if you have heard of it.
No, thank you for that question. I'm certainly not an expert in rewilding, but I know enough to be dangerous, as they say. I tend to agree in the sense of rewilding, as I understand it, follows the same logic in many ways of a protected area model, right? A fortress model. The idea being that, you know, you are repairing the land, you are introducing original species, you're planting new trees, you're returning the land to the way that it was in its original form, that has a lot of congruency with reparation, right? The idea of reparation, at least from a legal perspective, is returning victims to their original position. And if we're talking about nature, we're returning nature to their original position. Rewilding, you know, and there's a lot of it in the country that I work in, especially up north in Scotland. It's a huge controversy because huge swaths of land have to be cordoned off usually for these rewilding projects. And local communities, I think, are rightfully raising concerns about how this impacts particularly community land use, collective land use, because there are rights in that part of the world where people can access and have limited access over the land of another. To what extent is that congruent with rewilding, right? And I think there's always this tension that occurs with, or that, you know, that is beginning to really be present in the sense that we have all these kind of environmental initiatives, whether they be rewilding, you know, the big one now to some extent is carbon credits, carbon financing, and on the other end, it's which people are impacted by this. Who are the communities that tend to face consequences or negative impacts of whatever initiative we have? And I think rewilding is just one example where those are kind of coming ahead and playing out. But it's a rather new example too, in the sense of, you know, this is I guess a newer phenomenon than the protected area phenomenon. So. I think it's completely justified to draw the links between the two because the ideology behind the two remains the same, is that humans must be segregated from nature in order for that to flourish.
Well, if there are no further questions, I think we have come to the end of this panel. I want to thank all the speakers for your participation and also the audience. I hope we can continue this debate in the future. Okay, so we have come to the end now. Thank you.